I was trying to think of the best way to approach this next subject I want to talk about, because I can feel it growing larger in my mind as I'm trying to figure out what I want to say, and it's leading toward other roads, and I'm thinking, gosh, if I'm not careful and if I don't do some fancy trimming in my mind as I'm talking to you right now, I'm going to have a 45-minute piece right here that probably is very unfocused and goes into all kinds of issues and leaves a lot of things unanswered. I will endeavor to avoid that. But let me just say at the outset that, look, I know that I am not mainstream when it comes to public opinion. And I have gotten, or become, is probably the better word, I've become accustomed to being on the wrong end, the losing end of a lot of national arguments over, issues that affect the country and the population and the government. We call the show Common Sense, but it's sort of my view of common sense. We always say common sense is one of those things that's a little bit in the eye of the beholder, so just because I say it's common sense doesn't mean it's your common sense, and it certainly doesn't mean that it is the idea of the average Joe or Jane in the United States of what common sense is. And there's a whole host of issues you can look at where the common sense side of the issue, at least in the minds of most Americans, was on the opposite side of where I happen to be on it. But then things happen down the road that make me upset. Like I said, I can deal with the fact I'm on the wrong side of these issues, but a lot of times when down the road, the side that I was on is somehow proven to be correct, what bothers me is that we don't then act on the fact that, back in the day when we first had the discussion, we were wrong. Does that make sense, Ben? Does that make any sense at all? Let me tell you what's prompting this, and it'll start to make sense as we go on. There was a story, Associated Press piece made the rounds. I saw it on November 21st, 2008. The story I saw, although there's more than one, is by Steve LeBlanc and Julie Carr Smythe from the Associated Press. And my headline is, Activists Say Tobacco Settlement is Being Wasted. And what this is a story about, ladies and gentlemen, is back in the late 1990s, there were lawsuits where the states around the U.S. sued the tobacco companies for all of the money that tobacco has cost their states, since caveman times, I guess. There's a lot of legal wrangling back and forth, and eventually the tobacco companies pony up a lot of money in a sustained deal. I guess it was a ton of money outright, and then a bunch of money, from every year for years. A ton of money. And the way this thing was sold at the time was that this was going to be, money that went into anti-smoking efforts and costs. If you're dying from lung cancer because you smoked all these cigarettes, maybe this money could help you. If you're a school and you need an anti-smoking program or more money for your anti-smoking program, maybe this money could help you. You get the point. Now, many people said, although we were a distinct minority, and I was one of them, at the time, that this money had no strings attached and was not likely to go where the people who were selling this, plan to go after the tobacco companies were saying it was going to go. We told you this money is just money. And there's a lot of people out there that are trying to get their hands on this money. Don't buy into this idea that you're going to these evil tobacco companies and getting money out of their pockets to fund programs related to the damage their product causes, because that's not what it is. First of all, let's get something straight when we talk about tobacco companies. The money they get comes from the same place every company's money comes from, and that's the person who buys their stuff, you. Unless, of course, you know better than to buy cigarettes, and you don't buy cigarettes. Then where does the money come from? The people that do buy cigarettes. Who are the people that buy cigarettes? Look at the numbers. Mainly people on the lower end of the income scale. So let's not pretend that this is money from evil companies and they're being forced to do justice for what their product does. This is money from low-income Americans that you couldn't possibly have devised a public opinion campaign designed to go after them any other way. A tax the poor campaign, Ben. You could go to any firm on Madison Avenue. They're going to have a hard time coming up with that, unless you disguise it as a let's go after the tobacco companies tax. In any case, they did, and the money never ended up where it was supposed to go, and everyone is shocked. Well, that is people who even know about it. Don't know why stuff like this doesn't make the front page of all the newspapers like the tobacco stuff at the time did when all this lawsuit stuff was happening, but it doesn't. It's the old proverbial small correction in the back corner, Ben. This story's not small per se, but in comparison to what was running, it is the small correction at the back of the paper. And there's a lot of reasons for this. And let me back up a little bit to stay organized here. Let me just read you some of this story, and you'll get an idea of the numbers and what's going on. First of all, I want you to know I find it interesting how we even know about this story. The people that have made sure the media runs something on this are the people that bought into the idea back in the late 90s that we were suing the tobacco companies to recoup healthcare costs, and to promote anti-smoking and all that. This amount of money you were going to get out of them, I think it would be like $300 billion when all was said and done, was going to be this great thing that helped wipe tobacco out. Sounded like the Iran-Contra thing, Ben, but for tobacco. Sure, we'll take this money from the Iranians, who are bad people, and then we'll put it into the Nicaraguan Contras, and it'll be funding a good project with bad money. And it sounded like a good idea. This sounded like taking evil money from the smoking companies and using it to get people off of their very product. It's almost genius, isn't it? Anyway, let me read you a little bit of the piece. It says, in 2006, this is from the beginning of the article, by the way. In 2006, Alaska desperately needed cash to complete a museum featuring a mummified bison and other natural wonders of the frozen north. So the state dipped into its share of the landmark 1998 tobacco settlement. The billions that began flowing from cigarette makers to the states a decade ago also helped outfit the Niagara County, New York golf course with new carts and sprinklers. And the money has gone towards college scholarships in Michigan, tax breaks in Illinois and Ohio, a dog catcher in Lincoln, Nebraska, and jails and schools elsewhere around the country. Despite the promises of politicians and policymakers, states and counties have spent the lion's share of the settlement money on things that have nothing to do with public health or smoking. Get that, folks? Less than 4% of the $61.5 billion already divided between the states went to anti-smoking efforts. Less than 4%. Only 30% was spent on anything smoking related, healthcare, stuff like that. The states, according to this article, are defending the way that they spent the money by saying, hey, for years we had to pay for all these smokers, and the money could have gone elsewhere, but it didn't. So now when we got the money, we spent it on things we hadn't been able to spend it on when they were, soaking us all the time with their smoking-related illness costs. Okay. But here's the thing. That's not the way they sold this at the time. One of the wonderful things about getting older, Ben, there's a lot of things that aren't very good at all, of course. But one of the things about getting older is you get to live through a full cycle of things. Well, on these smaller cycles we call our lifespan. You get through a decade of active adult memory and things start coming back again. And now you can say, wait a minute, I know about this. I lived through this once before, right? Well, I lived through this tobacco settlement story. I was covering it every day, right? We're talking about this every day, experts on every day. I remember how they sold this thing. I don't have to take some book's word for it. I was there. This was going to help kids. This was going to fund programs that saved people's lives. I mean, this was sold to the American people as God's own lawsuit. I remember. The story says, at the time, many states intended to spend settlement money on health care and anti-smoking campaigns. Quote, we should use this money to fight cancer, offer health insurance to the poor, keep kids from smoking, and arrest those who sell tobacco products to our children, said then Pennsylvania Attorney General Mike Fisher. But even then, the story says, lawmakers and others were eyeing the money for other needs. Gregory Connolly, director of Massachusetts' Tobacco Control Program, from 1993 to 2003, this from the story also, folks, said the failure to funnel more money into anti-smoking campaigns was a retreat from implicit promises made at the time of the settlement. Quote, every state court case had that built into it, that we're here for the kids, Connolly said. But the legislatures said, this is our money, thanks for suing, but we're going to decide how to spend it. Do you get that, folks? The reason this story even exists is because the people that were in the forefront of this, that I would say now naive people who were in the forefront of this lawsuit thing, didn't get the funds. A lot of people jumped on the bandwagon to get the funds, but when the funds were distributed, lawyers take their cut. A little bit of money symbolically goes into some of these causes, and the rest goes elsewhere.